Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Big Jim Doherty was a sport. He was part of a special group of men. In Manhattan, they are a special group. They are like the Caribs of the North, strong, clever, independent, close-knit, and honorable within their own rules. They don't think much of other groups who follow society's rules. This special group is like the nobility of sports. There are some people who might be called tin, but Big Jim Doherty was never called that. These sportsmen usually stay in the lobby or outside corner of certain hotels and restaurants. They are men of different sizes, from small to large, but they all have recently shaved, blue-black cheeks and chins, and wear dark overcoats with black velvet collars when in season. Not much is known about their home life. Some say that Cupid and Hymen, love and marriage, sometimes get involved, and a sport might get a wife and even have children. Sometimes he gets involved in politics, and at chowder picnics, you might see a Mrs. Sport and little sports with shiny hats and tin pails. But mostly, the sport likes to keep his family life private. His women stay behind decorated windows or flowered balconies. They wait for him there, with fancy rugs, sweet-sounding birds, musical instruments, and sweet treats. But away from home, the sport is independent. Unlike other men in Manhattan, he does not spend his free time with women in pretty dresses and high heels. He stays with his own group on corners and talks about the people passing by in his own special language. Big Jim Doherty had a wife, but he did not wear a picture of her on his jacket. He had a home in a brownstone house with iron railings on the west side, which looked like an old bowling alley in Pompeii. Mr. Doherty went to this home each night when it was very late, with nothing fun left to do. By that time, his wife would be asleep, the birds quiet, and it would be time to sleep. Big Jim always woke up at 12 o'clock for breakfast, and soon after, he would go back to meet his friends. He always knew he had a wife, Mrs. Doherty. He would agree that the quiet, neat, comfortable woman across the table at home was his wife. He remembered they had been married for almost 4 years. She would often tell him about the funny tricks of Spot, the canary, and the blonde lady who lived in the window of the apartment across the street. Big Jim Doherty sometimes listened to her talk. He knew she would have a nice dinner ready for him every evening at 7 when he came home. She sometimes went to afternoon shows and had a music player with many records. Once, when her Uncle Amos visited from upstate, she went with him to the Eden Museum. These things were enough fun for any woman. One afternoon, Mr. Doherty finished his breakfast, put on his hat, and was about to leave. When his hand was on the door, he heard his wife's voice. "Jim," she said firmly, "I wish you would take me out to dinner tonight. It has been 3 years since you have been outside with me." Big Jim was surprised. She had never asked for anything like this before. It felt very new to him. But he was a good sport. "All right," he said. "Be ready when I come at 7. No waiting 2 minutes and then getting ready for an hour or 2, okay, Deli?" "I'll be ready," said his wife, calmly. At 7, she walked down the stone steps beside Big Jim Doherty. She wore a fancy dress made of fabric so delicate it looked like spiders had woven it. The color was like the sky at twilight. A light coat with many extra, Unnecessary ribbons floated down from her shoulders. The saying, "Fine feathers make fine birds," means people look nice when they dress well. Big Jim Doherty was worried. The woman next to him seemed different. He remembered the plain clothes his wife usually wore, and this change surprised him. She looked like the Delia Cullen he had married 4 years ago. Shyly and awkwardly, he walked beside her. "After dinner, I'll take you back home, Deli," said Mr. Doherty, "and then I'll go back to Seltzer's with the boys. You can have a nice dinner tonight. I won some money yesterday, so you can choose anything you like." Mr. Doherty had planned to make this outing with his wife very quiet. Showing love for one's wife was not common in his group. If any of his friends had wives, they never talked about them in public. There were many small restaurants near the main street, and he planned to take her to one of these so they wouldn't be noticed. But on the way, Mr. Doherty changed his mind. He kept looking at his beautiful wife and realized she deserved better. He decided to walk with his wife past Seltzer's Cafe, where many of his friends would be watching the evening crowd. Yes, he would take her to Hoogley's, the fanciest restaurant, he decided. The group of well-dressed men at Seltzer's were watching. When Mr. Doherty and his lovely Delia walked by, they stared, surprised, and then took off their hats. This was very unusual for them. On Mr. Doherty's face, there was a small look of pride, a tiny look, just enough to be seen. Hoogley's was lively. The electric lights were bright as expected. The tablecloths, glasses, and flowers all looked very nice. The guests were many, well-dressed, and happy. A waiter took Big Jim Doherty and his wife to a table. "Order anything you like," Deli said Big Jim. "Tonight, you can have anything you want. I think we've been eating at home too much." Big Jim's wife gave her order. He looked at her with respect. She mentioned truffles, and he was surprised she knew about them. From the wine list, she chose a good and desirable brand. He looked at her with admiration. She was very excited and happy. She was talking to him about many things with joy. As they ate, her pale cheeks from staying inside got a light blush. Big Jim looked around the room and saw that none of the women there were as charming as his wife. He thought about the 3 years she stayed at home without complaining, and he felt ashamed because he believed in being fair. But when the Honorable Patrick Corrigan, a leader in Doherty's area and his friend, saw them and came to their table, things got more interesting. The Honorable Patrick was a kind man in both actions and words. He was very charming and friendly. "Jimmy, old friend," he called out, clapping Doherty on the back and smiling brightly at Delia. "Honorable Mr. Corrigan, Mrs. Doherty," said Big Jim. The Honorable Patrick was very entertaining and full of praise. The waiter brought another chair for him. He joined them at the table, and the wine glasses were filled again. "You selfish old rascal," he said, shaking a playful finger at Big Jim, "keeping Mrs. Doherty a secret from us." And then Big Jim Doherty, who didn't talk much, sat quietly and watched his wife change. The woman who had eaten at home every evening for 3 years became lively and bright. She was quick, funny, and charming. She talked easily and made the Honorable Patrick laugh and admire her. She opened up like a flower, and the room felt like a beautiful garden. They tried to include Big Jim in the conversation, but he didn't have much to say. Then a group of politicians and friends who loved sports came into the room. They saw Big Jim and the leader and came over to meet Mrs. Doherty. In a few minutes, she was the center of attention. Half a dozen men surrounded her, all enjoying her company. Big Jim sat there, thinking, 3 years, 3 years. The dinner ended. The Honorable Patrick reached for Mrs. Doherty's coat, but Big Jim got it first by 2 seconds. While they were saying goodbye at the door, the Honorable Patrick gave Doherty a friendly hit on the back. "Jimmy, my friend," he said in a loud whisper, "your wife is amazing. You are very lucky." Big Jim walked home with his wife. She seemed just as happy with the lights and shop windows in the streets as she was with the admiration of the men in Hooglies. As they passed Seltzer's, they heard many voices in the cafe. The boys were probably having drinks and talking about the past. At the door of their home, Delia stopped. She was glowing with happiness from their night out. She knew she couldn't expect Jim to spend every evening with her, but the joy from tonight would make her happy for a long time. "Thank you for taking me out, Jim," she said, gratefully. "You'll be going back to Seltzer's now, of course." "To heck with Seltzer's," said Big Jim, strongly. "And darn Pat Corrigan. Does he think I can't see?" And the door closed behind both of them.